Welcome back to our latest explainer. Today, we're taking a really deep dive into one of the most famous events in history. But, we aren't just looking at this as a tragedy. We're actually going to treat this 110-year-old wreckage exactly like what it is to modern researchers, which is a scientific crime scene. We're heading back into the dark, freezing waters of the Atlantic Ocean, about 700 kilometers off the coast of Newfoundland, to look at the cold, hard data. All right, let's jump right in. Right off the bat, doing recent investigations of the wreck, researchers noticed this massive anomaly. The ship's bow, so the front section, is sitting down there on the ocean floor in remarkably good condition. But the stern, the back section, is just an absolute mess. I mean, it is completely obliterated. And you have to ask yourself, if both of these pieces belonged to the exact same ship, they're made of the exact same iron and steel, and they sank at the exact same time, why on earth is there such a staggering difference in how they look today? Well, that brings us right to the second part of our central mystery. Not only is the stern totally destroyed, but it's sitting a full 2,000 feet away from that intact bow. 2,000 feet? That's almost half a mile. Researchers quickly realized that on the night of the accident, something else must have happened to the Titanic besides just hitting an iceberg. Something violently specific had to have destroyed the stern and essentially thrown it almost half a mile away from the rest of the wreckage. To really understand how we solve this, we've got to look at the timeline. Back in 1912, there were 2,240 people on board, and tragically, 1,500 of them lost their lives. The very first rescue ship, the RMS Carpathia, didn't even arrive until an hour and a half after the Titanic went under. So for 73 years, literally the only evidence we had of what happened to the so-called unsinkable ship came from traumatized eyewitnesses who were fighting for their lives in freezing water. It honestly wasn't until the wreckage was finally discovered over 7 decades later that science could actually step in to answer the questions those survivors left behind. Exhibit A, the myth of the giant gash. Okay, so to understand this first piece of the puzzle, we have to question those initial 1912 reports, because there is a massive gap here between human perception and physical reality. According to the original survivor accounts and the very first investigation reports, the iceberg allegedly tore a massive 300-foot hole into the right side of the ship. Think about that. That means a third of the entire side of the Titanic was ripped wide open. But when ocean explorer P.H. Nargilly visited the wreck over 30 times, he never once found a 300-foot hole. Instead, the hard scientific evidence shows a damaged area spanning just 30 feet. And here is the absolutely crucial point. The actual physical opening that was exposed to the ocean wasn't some giant 300-foot canyon. It was just an 11-square-foot crack. Let that sink in for a second. If a 300-foot hole had actually been ripped into the hull, the ship wouldn't have taken hours to sink. No way. It would have completely vanished beneath the waves in mere minutes. So, let's apply a little math to that 11-square-foot crack. Modern calculations reveal that a staggering 370 gallons of water were entering the Titanic's hull every single second through that relatively small opening. To put that into perspective, imagine dumping about 10 full bathtubs of water into a ship every single second. When we piece this sequence together, it builds a totally flawless forensic case. Step 1, 370 gallons of water rush in per second. Step 2, this relatively steady flow slowly fills up the bow, making it incredibly heavy and slowly pulling the front of the ship down into the ocean. Step 3, at this highly specific rate of flooding, it would take the Titanic exactly 2.5 hours to sink. And guess what? The eyewitnesses stated that the ship took exactly 2.5 hours to go down. So using pure math and forensic science, we've basically solved our first mystery and totally busted the myth of the 300-foot gash. Moving right along to Exhibit B, a tale of two halves. Now, to figure out why the back half of the ship looks like a crushed piece of paper compared to the front, researchers used remotely operated vehicles to build a super detailed 3D computer model of the wreck. And the physics of the sinking explain it perfectly. The bow of the ship was highly hydrodynamic. I mean, it was literally designed to slice through water. So when it sank, it just glided down relatively smoothly and landed pretty much intact. But the 392-foot stern, it had terrible hydrodynamics for a vertical drop. It took the entire brunt of the water's blunt force. Because of its awkward shape, it essentially power dived into the dark ocean, spinning wildly and just shredding itself as the immense water pressure ripped away loose parts, completely crushing its decks down into one another. And those 3D models actually revealed a hidden clue that human eyes could never naturally see at that extreme depth. There are these 110-year-old impact marks directly imprinted on the ocean floor all around the stern. These are essentially forensic footprints, and they prove that the stern was locked in a terrifying anti-clockwise death spiral, plummeting at an astonishing 80 kilometers per hour before it violently slammed into the bottom, 4 kilometers down. That 80 kilometers per hour impact is exactly why the stern looks like it went through a giant garbage compactor. Okay, on to Exhibit C, unlocking the debris field. So we have solved the gash, and we've solved the crushed stern. Now for the final piece of our structural puzzle. Exactly when and where did this massive ship actually snap in half? For years and years, based entirely on eyewitness accounts, the accepted truth was that the Titanic broke completely into 2 separate pieces while it was still floating way up on the surface. The theory was that when the front filled with water and sank downward, all that massive weight pivoted onto the center point of the ship, which couldn't bear the load, and it snapped. But looking at our 3D sonar scanning data, we are forced to ask a huge question. If they cleanly separated at the surface, 4 kilometers above the ground, why is the debris field so relatively contained? To really understand this, we need to look at what is actually lying down there. There are over 10,000 haunting items scattered across the ocean floor. We're talking about everyday things like coffee cups and dinner plates, up to ornate chandeliers, and even 2 massive, house-sized engines that are actually still attached to the stern. And of course, heartbreakingly, people's personal luggage. But here is the vital forensic clue. 90% of all these spilled items come exclusively from the torn stern section. And get this, all of those 10,000 items are contained within an area of exactly 3.2 square kilometers. That specific number is the ultimate forensic key to solving our final structural mystery. Think about it like dropping a handful of coins from an airplane versus dropping them from a foot off the ground. If the stern had fully 100% separated from the bow all the way up on the ocean surface, the ocean currents would have caught all those falling plates, cups, and pieces of luggage over that massive 4-kilometer drop. The debris field wouldn't be just 3.2 square kilometers, it would be scattered across a massively wider area. Because the debris field is actually so tight, experts now conclude that while the ship definitely did crack and break on the surface, the 2 halves actually stayed connected, most likely by the keel during the incredibly long plunge downward. It was only when they got near the ocean floor that they completely snapped apart, which caused the stern to spiral those final 2,000 feet away. Which brings us to the final verdict, a ticking clock. We've used modern science to solve the mysteries of how it sank, how it broke apart, and why it sits exactly the way it does today. But we are now facing a very somber reality. The scientific investigation of the Titanic is quite literally racing against a ticking clock. Usually, when a ship sinks to these extreme ocean depths, the extreme lack of oxygen means the rusting process is incredibly slow. But the Titanic? It's under a totally unique biological attack. Researchers have found that the rust on the ship is actually being caused by metal-eating bacteria. These incredible microscopic organisms actually release their own oxygen to consume the iron, drastically accelerating the decay of the entire ship's body. And this leaves us with an incredibly profound realization. The scientific window is rapidly closing. Because of these fast-acting metal-eating bacteria, experts predict that in the coming years, the iconic floors of the Titanic will completely collapse inward. The world's most famous shipwreck will lose its original shape forever, eventually just dissolving back into the ocean floor. The unsinkable ship may have finally been found 73 years later, but honestly, how much longer do we really have until it vanishes for good?